It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time now, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, good day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. We've got our presidential election special today. That means we're only sticking with the US and the coverage of the election, which occurred yesterday. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm excellent.
Tell me a little bit about the coverage of the election in Hong Kong, how it was received there.
A lot of coverage in the paper, in our South China Morning Post, and people were talking about it. We have quite a lot of Americans who live here. My local pub opened early yesterday for breakfast because they had a lot of customers who wanted to come in and pull the big screen down and watch CNN all morning. The publican Patrick wasn't looking forward to it really because he finds they tend to bicker from table to table. And he also has problems with the local journalists who want to come in and interview people, and he doesn't allow that. You can interview them outside, but he doesn't want
a couple of large blokes out the front then.
No, you don't really need that in Hong Kong, you know.
No. Okay, yeah, look, for me...
And that's kind of typical, yeah.
Yeah, it was an exhausting day for me, trying to ride around a rapidly changing set of circumstances. I suppose I must confess that I was sort of prepared for a long count, and I thought Pennsylvania would take days, and it certainly didn't. And I thought it'd be not so much on the knife edge, but there'd just be the administrative business of counting. So I was, watching the election coverage from multiple networks, and then, as it seemed, Harris was in front in Pennsylvania. We're getting some Michigan early, she led an account. And I just thought, well, it looks like it's going to be a 3 or 4 day exercise. So I was writing around that. And then, of course, everything changed. And it changed quite quickly by around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our time, or Australian time, not your time. And it became very, very clear. Would you call it a landslide victory, Jack? It looks like you get about 312 college votes.
Near enough to a landslide if it's not one. I didn't actually watch it all as it happened. I generally do, but I saw something on Twitter last night where a journalist who I quite like, who writes for the Washington Post, said that she'd been talking to her father about doing all of this, and he said, and he's a pollster, and he said, you're better off going back to Harris. Is it called Harriscopy, where you cut the entrails out of animals and read the entrails?
It's funny you should say that, because that was a big part of what I was writing about was necromancy and goat entrails. And I actually even did a little bit of research on the digestive system of the goat, Jack. So I could identify bits and pieces that the necromancers would be looking through.
So the things we get into. So her dad thought that watching the exit polls and the early returns and all that sort of stuff was very much akin to looking at the entrails of a goat, and it was a waste of time. So I didn't look at it again until my WhatsApp started to ping with people who were giving me their views of the results, and that was probably about 3 o'clock your time. 3 o'clock your time.
That's when it really looked ominous for Harris and looked very strong. By that stage, Arizona had opened, and Pennsylvania, well, he just took a lead. One of my colleagues rang me and said, Wall Street Journal's got him ahead in Pennsylvania, and it was just a narrow 1,000 or so votes, and then it was 50, then 100, and then 200,000 votes in Pennsylvania, and it became very clear that it was a comprehensive victory. As it stands in the college, Trump 295, Harris 226, with Arizona and Nevada still in doubt, but it would seem a Trump victory in both states is quite likely. That gives him another 17 electoral college votes, and that takes him to 312. Not a landslide in American presidential, by American presidential definition. 1984, Reagan carried 49 states, and the landslide mark is usually around 400. But a comprehensive win, and furthermore, a comprehensive win in the Senate. House still being counted, but it looks like Trump will have, or the GOP will have, will have the numbers in both houses, and that's the way it all panned out. It wasn't really close at all, Jack.
Which was, I got to say, it's gone pretty much as I expected it to go, and that's because Trump outperformed the polls by a long way in 2016, still by a fair way in 2020, and my guess was that even though the polls,
it was worse in 2020. They underestimated it. So I remember that Biden was ahead by 7 points in the polls in Pennsylvania. And it looked to be he was going to walk it in there, but he won it by less than one. So that the Trump vote was understated by 6 points in 2016 in aggregate polling, and closer to 10, Jack, in 2020.
Yeah.
And so the polling companies sought to moderate their polling, and I guess a lot of people sought some comfort from that, thinking, oh, well, they may have overstated his vote, but of course they've understated it again.
And my view going into this was that it's probably going to be understated by somewhere between 3 and 5%. And therefore, when the polls were tied, I read that as a Trump win.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the popular vote, and Trump's won the popular vote, which is extraordinary. And although the Democrat vote, as counting continues, will won't level it up, but it'll draw them a little closer. Yeah, if it was a 50-50, then as most polls were indicating, if it was a 50-50, then we agreed in previous episodes that would not be enough for her to win the popular vote, and certainly not the college. So there is this sort of shy voter Trump. I've been reading a little bit about it before, but before we go on, and I know this is minutiae because New York State was never going to turn red, but some of the results there are absolutely staggering outside of Manhattan. So Biden won New York 63-37 in 2020, and Harris won it by 55-44. So that's a huge shift, That's a really big shift in voter support. Now, again, New York is not going to determine, the state of New York is not going to determine the outcome of the election. That comes down to the battleground states. But the vote there is a bit of a mirror image on what has actually happened.
Even in Manhattan, Trump won New York, Manhattan. So he didn't win New York, Manhattan, Jews, but he got 40% of the vote. They're best about the most progressive people on the planet.
It wasn't quite as high as that. But outside of, and in the 5 boroughs and in upstate New York, we were seeing a big mix of demographics. And what I'm saying is that, where you've got Hispanic, white, black Americans, etc., the idea that, the GOP has come out as the multi-ethnic party now. It's representing the interests of Latinos, representing the interests of black males, representing the interests of young males. The idea, too, that women would come out and vote in hordes for Kamala Harris didn't eventuate either. And what we're seeing is, in the analysis, and there'll be more and more of it, is that suburban women supported Trump. And I think that's quite a shock, too. So I just want to read Nate Silver. I don't think anyone will be reading Nate too much in the future, so we might give him his little swan song here until things heat up again around the midterms in 2026. But he mentions the New York factor. He said, I believe the clarity of this election may prove to be helpful in the long run to Democrats. There won't be quite so much second guessing of the little decisions. I'll shut up about she should have picked Shapiro because it wouldn't have mattered when Harris lost every swing state. And the most important decision, Biden's choice to run for another term, will and should be scrutinised. But I suppose my gut is that a Whitmer-Shapiro ticket would have won a few of those swing states and probably the popular vote, but still not the Electoral College. He mentions also the New York fact. He was in New York City. He said it was like a graveyard. Manhattan was like a graveyard as Trump was announced as the victor. So the polling was wrong again, understated the Trump vote again. Why is that happening, Jack?
Well, I think you said before there is a concept of a shy Trump voter of that. It is so socially unpopular to say that you support Trump that people, if asked, will deny it.
Yeah, I think there's, you might call it a stigma. I was just reading about this morning, and I was quite taken by some of the analysis that because American politics, like politics pretty much around the world, has become hyper-partisan, that people don't really want to talk about it all that much, even to a polling company. Does that make sense? I mean, it's not just that they're shy to announce their intentions, but they're shy to announce their intentions because they don't want to have a partisan brawl or be seen to be doing that. So one of the behavioural guys they had on Just USA Today said, as human beings, we have a hard time with ambiguity. There may still be some questions as to what's going to happen. There's what he said he is going to do and what is actually going to happen. There's questions on both sides. But earlier on, he said Trumpism has become a kind of epithet. This is Matthew Dallek, a historian and professor of political management at George Washington University. He said, I imagine that there are some Trump voters who are reluctant to admit or openly acknowledge their support for Trump. But he says that it's probably more likely that in a hyper-partisan environment, people just don't want to, people are reluctant to put their name or their political affiliations or support out there in the public zone.
Is there only one of the American guys I know in Hong Kong who was unequivocal in his support for Donald Trump, and God bless him, Josh is famously unconcerned about what anybody else thinks about him. So he's fearless. So, but generally speaking,
that's why I thought the shy Trump factor may not be as profound this time around, because Trump's been in the system now since 2016, been in the political system, been there for 8 years. And look, his supporters, these voluble supporters certainly aren't shy, but middle America obviously is a little bit more constrained. But yes, again, I think they've underestimated his vote by at least 3 or 4%. And most importantly, Jack, we have to acknowledge this. I mean, Trump is now the most significant political figure of the 21st century. I mean, this is an astonishing comeback.
Yeah, part of this is class. Some part, I don't know how much of it, but some part of the hatred of Trump comes down to plain ordinary snobbery. Trump is crass, boorish, a braggart. He's low class. He would prefer a cheeseburger to a really good meal, all this kind of stuff. And for people who see themselves as high class, well-educated, that's terrible. That puts him beyond the par. And that's part of the reason, I think, why people don't do it. But some of it's just plain snobbery.
Well, I'm not sure about that either. I mean, you could say the same sort of things about Nixon. You could say not so much about Reagan. You could say the same or similar things around Bush. The difference is that Trump was a maverick in 2016, and he remains in that sort of maverick column, even though he's been a president for 4 years and about to be president for another 4 years.
Now, Bush was a waspish northeasterner before he moved to Texas. These people were in that kind of top level class. Trump isn't. Trump he's made some money. Who knows how much? But he's still the bloke from Queens.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about snobbery, Jack. I mean, what we're talking about is a reaction to some of the things that he says that, insulting to people, that are offensive to others. We talked about the Madison Square Gardens event there, where there's certainly some very odd things said, and it seems to just sort of wash over. Sometimes he's taken out of context. There was the comment there about Liz Cheney and how she should face 9 rifles with her 1. The context was missing in a lot of the criticism there, that he had sort of suggested she was a war hawk and that she was basically sending people off to battle who would face those sorts of circumstances.
Which is a tired old trope. The Madison Square Garden thing, I saw a comment in an interview with a Puerto Rican American just yesterday, and she was asked about that. And she said she didn't like what the comedian said. She was pissed off about that, about, Puerto Rico being a garbage dump or whatever. But she said, but people are telling me I've got to put up with being called Latinx. And people are telling me that I've got to believe in things that I can't see.
That's a bigger issue. That's a much bigger issue. I mean, we'll get to some of the Democrats failing shortly. I certainly I certainly get all of that, but snobbishness, I would think, is the least of the Democrats' problems.
Well, no, I don't think it is, because they haven't nominated a non-snob for a while. You look at them since Bill Clinton, Al Gore, John Kerry, even Obama was a bit of a snob, Hillary Clinton, terrible snob, and Harris, all snobs. None of them can, apart from Obama, none of them can go on a line at a rally and talk to ordinary people comfortably. Not one of them. Joe Biden
Biden couldn't do it.
He's the exception. Biden and Obama could both at least talk to ordinary people, but none of the others can. They're all hopeless at it.
I'm not sure I'd say that about Harris either, but we want to get to the Democrats' issues. But firstly, when we do look at polling, there is some polling there that I think we really do need to focus on. And it's something that you've been looking at a fair bit and mentioning in our programs over the last probably 18 months.
Banging on about it, I would put it.
yeah, banging on, but to the point of irritation.
Yes, I know.
But look, these are really significant figures. So there's 17% believe they are better off in 2024 than in 2020. There's obviously an element that says that they're about break even, and then there was a strong element that said they're worse off. 70%, it got as high as that, but it was always in the 60s, believed the country was going in the wrong direction. And when you think about that, and you think about the impact of inflation on voters, I mean, inflation is the vote killer for sitting governments. And
always has been, always will be.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so you think with those sorts of things, 70% of people believe the country's going in the wrong direction. You would say, and this is a point that Adam Crichton made in the Australian a couple of weeks ago, that Trump, and he's on the ground, so we'll back him in. He was saying that basically Trump had to win because this was an unlosable election for the GOP.
Well, that's certainly how I saw it. There was only one issue of all the issues that people thought were important where Harris was ahead, and that was abortion. But everything everything else, the economy, immigration, the two big issues, Trump was well ahead. So you put on the issues, he should win, because if you're in front on the economy, you nearly always win. That and the fact that they nominated a candidate who their own party wouldn't have given the nod to if they had a chance. So you've got a bad candidate and bad policy.
We'll get to the Democrats in a minute, but I think that's right. So he had the economy working for him. He had immigration working for him. In the exit polling, and really, listeners, exit polling, we could talk about all the junk polling that preceded the election. That's been provably wrong, in or outside their dubious margins of error. But the worst form of polling is exit polling. And firstly, that's because it's face-to-face. Secondly, it's kind of vox poppy, right? So there's not enough of a sample to draw anything. Yeah. And thirdly, if you've been standing in line for 2 hours to vote, you might just be inclined to take the piss out of the bloke who stuck a microphone under your nose.
We would hope you would be.
So what we saw in Pennsylvania, and CNN was ruminating about this. There's always that long lead up before votes actually start tumbling out, and it was not long after, I think, Kentucky. Well, traditionally, there's a very small county in Hampshire with 6 voters, and they report on the night before. And but after that, there's Kentucky was the first state to actually be posting votes and results. And they had interviewed on CNN. They'd done the exit polling, and they found that women's reproductive rights and something vaguely called democracy. I mean, we know what democracy is, but how does it relate to voting intention? I just don't know. Made up 48% of voting intention or voting determinant. And I remember thinking about that. I said, that's just the most meaningless figure I've ever heard of. I mean, democracy, I'm voting for democracy. Well, you're very active of you entering a polling booth is an act of is a democratic act. But so they were stuck on that for a while. CNN, Jack. It was hard watching them throughout the day. I thought their analysis.
It's terrible television.
Oh, the analysis on the maps wasn't bad, but the panel stuff was terrible. And so they were trying to, it's filler really. And then there is this sort of great rush as enormous votes come in. But But in the early days, my Lord, it was pretty hard to watch.
There are some moments of humour. One that I thought was quite funny. Jake Tapper was on CNN talking to their data guy, and he was asking the data guy for all of these things, and the data guy's got the big map there and the various buttons on it to produce things. And they're talking about, well, how does Harris compare to how Biden went? And the data bloke with a straight face says, I'll show you all of the counties in the US where she's outperformed Biden. And he presses the button. And this was late at night in US time. And the whole map's come up and every spot on the map is grey. And Tapper's saying, so which are the ones where she's there are none, not one.
Yeah.
But that was at least funny.
Early days, I saw some movements in Iowa, and I thought, well, there's the Seltzer poll, obviously sort of indicated that Harris
she was only
3
out by
points
14 points. Don't be harsh on her. She's
it's
only out by...
It's a fair moment. So I looked at some of the results as Iowa came in, and it was she was in front early days, and that was presumably because they were looking at sort of town and city centres. Yeah. And there were a couple little places where she did actually pick up, but those quickly fell by the wayside.
Yeah,
so Ms. Seltzer will be. I mean, there's a lot of polling companies. You would have to say, listen, don't bother me again. Don't ever bother me again with your nonsense. I'm not believing you anymore.
So Seltzer is the local polling guru in Des Moines, Iowa, and Iowa's a funny kind of place. I mean, it's got college towns like Iowa City and all that sort of stuff where you're going to get high Democrat numbers. But she came out and I think her predictions were out by 14 points. From where it ended up.
There's not a margin of error big enough to cope with that.
That's such a huge miss that a local Iowan said, I work in data at a different level, but if someone had a track record like that, you'd never think about giving them a contract to do any work for you.
I think probably the Atlas Intel poll will be the one that's seen to be closest to the result, Jack. Now, Atlas Intel, we've talked about a little bit. It was, they sort of self-claimed the prize of being as close as anybody in 2020. I think they'll be as close as anybody else. And what they're doing, Jack, is internet polling with a set group of people and asking them the same questions over and over weeks and months.
Which is kind of what the parties do with their internal polling.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not sort of focus
Which is
group.
always more accurate.
It's a little bit different to a focus group because you are talking about a group ideally of 1,000 or more, but the same people. So we talked about the NBC poll, and I don't want to bore people about it, but once you looked at that, that had Kamala up by 5% in September and then down by 5% of October. And all they'd done was look at a randomised group of 1,000 voters in September, got a result from that, and then looked at another randomised group of 1,000, and they're all registered voters, and came up with a different result.
Surprisingly.
Polling like that, Jack, they'll say they've got a 3% margin of error, but because they're asking, I guess, a two-part question, and that is who would you vote for, Donald Trump or Part B, Kamala Harris, that takes the margin of error up to 6. Now, that poll in October had them 50-50. So, but if you put a margin of error in at 6, it means Kamala Harris is going to get between 44 and 56% of the vote, as is Trump. And kind of, we already knew that, right? I mean, it was going to fall within those broad categories anyway. So a lot of terrible polling, but a lot of terrible politics from the Dems. What did they do wrong? They lost support among black voters, males especially, Latinos, and we were just talking about this, Jack, and I'll let you go in a minute, but the Democrats have been dealing with the Latino vote, which is an emerging group and a very powerful group now, but they deal with them as this one great big slab of people. But there are Latinos who are old, young, somewhere in between. There are male, there are female, there are people who are aspirational, there are people who are content. They're looking at this great big emerging demographic that will determine and has in many ways yesterday determine the result, but dealing with them as this sort of amorphous group rather than people within it.
Even more
Sorry.
basically than you said. There are Mexicans, there are Cubans, there are Dominicans, there are Puerto Ricans.
Sorry, yes, of course, yeah.
I mean, and they don't see the world the same way, you know. It's a
So you
were
can't
talking
say.
before.
Go on.
You're talking before about how people view the economy, and you're right. I have been banging on about this for a long time because it just seemed to me that makes an election nearly unwinnable if people think you've got the economy wrong. And my couple of mates who are well versed in economics would sort of explain to me why the people were wrong, in effect, by saying, well, the figures actually for the economy are pretty good. And they'd go like this. And I'm kind of thinking, well, the people who are checking out at Walmart, they haven't got the graphs in front of them to prove that the economy is going pretty good. As far as they're concerned, it's going terrible, and that's what matters.
Yeah, inflation down to 2.1 in the United States. So that's the hard figure, and there have been declines in oil prices, or petrol prices at the pump, gas at the pump. That was really pissing off quite a lot of Americans for a long time. Love their cars, of course. But yeah, inflationary environments, when you've still got, and this is something Trump hammered away at, and so did J.D. Vance, was the cost of groceries, the cost of food, which is still high. And that's the one that people don't think, oh, inflation's 2.1. What they're saying is it cost me $120 to buy groceries, and 6 months ago it was only costing me $100. That's the sort of stuff they're thinking.
Well, what they're thinking of particularly is, say, from 2020 to now, grocery prices have gone up across the board, minimum 20%, and they haven't come back down again. So they're still thinking, I'm worse off than I was in 2020.
Yeah, well, it's the data says that there has been a reduction, but again, people don't, as you say, don't take the graph with them at the checkout. They're saying, well, this is costing me even more. And look, we're getting similar responses from Australians. With supermarket shopping, which I do on a regular basis, there's just sort of incredible price hikes in foods that you can only just see as profiteering. And anyway, we had unhappy Americans with the economy. Would Biden have done any better?
No, and there's a reason for that. Biden's popularity fell off a cliff after the Kabul disaster and never recovered.
Yeah, that's when his polling went into free fall. You're quite right. How much blame should he carry for this? He thinks he would have won it.
He should carry a fair bit of the blame, as should the party around him, people like Obama and Pelosi and stuff. He should never have been the candidate through the primary season.
He should have been well and truly tapped.
Yep.
Well in advance.
That conversation.
Maybe that happened. We don't know. Because I always sensed a deep disappointment from the man that he wasn't allowed to take on Trump. He would say that he was the only one to have beaten him.
I'm sure he believes that, but they should have had the Godfather conversation. When the consigliere is told that he's no longer in the job. They should have had that well before the primary started, and they did the Democrat Party a great deal of harm by not doing that. I mean, the Democrats have messed this up all the way through.
Well, I don't think they've learned anything from the 2016 episode, Jack. I don't think they've done, and they've been wallpapering over the cracks ever since. And you could pretty much say the same thing about Biden's candidacy in 2020, although he went through a primary race. Of course, Kamala Harris didn't, and I think there might have been a sense from voters there too that this was government by elites, etc., taking Biden out. Not allowing Democrat rank and file to vote on who their candidate should be in that absence. It would an open primary all the way back in August. Would that have changed things? I doubt it. But
yes, it would have. There's no way she wins the primary. There would have been a much better candidate.
She wouldn't have won the primary. But what I'm saying is, if let's say a Shapiro emerged in that primary race, I don't think Shapiro would have put his hand up anyway, which left really the California governor pretty much on his own. I don't think he wanted to have a crack either.
But he would have been a much better candidate.
I believe so too. But I honestly think both men looked at the situation, and I think Shapiro is probably the front runner for 2028, although it's a little bit early to say. Yeah. Both men looked at that and thought, well, if I get stuck into this now, bearing in mind all the things we've just talked about in terms of inflation, in terms of how Americans perceive government, and thought, well, if I get flogged here, that's the end of my national political career. This way, I can have a crack in 2028, and I may well be a chance.
But you never know that this might be your last chance. People, they tend to have a crack if they can. But if you just look at the Democrats' mistakes, 18 months ago, Trump wasn't going to be the candidate. Pre the indictments, Trump wasn't going to be the candidate. They were a terrible idea. They indicted him back into the campaign, into the race. So they made that mistake. Then they didn't shift Joe on. That's another mistake. And then they've got all these unpopular policies. They're pursuing policies that people just won't vote for.
Well, the DOJ, I mean, yes, look, these things, I mean, look, we also have to quickly state, Jack, that Trump is due for sentencing on November 26th in New York over 34 convictions there. I suspect that now will be a fine rather than a jail term. I cannot see how that would change anything. What are your thoughts? It will disappear into the it's on appeal forever, and no one ever cares about what happens to it at the end. I'm not like you who thinks that the DOJ should have cut him a pass after what happened in 2020 on January 6th, particularly, and his behaviour after the election result.
Let me be clear about that. There is a clause in the US law, 18 US Code 2383, which makes it an offence to incite an insurrection, and the penalty for that is up to 10 years in jail, and you are barred from standing for public office, from holding public office forever, right? And had he been charged with that, that might have made some sense, but he hasn't been. All of the DOJ has...
Incitement charges are almost impossible to prosecute.
No, I don't think that's true. But they could have charged him with the obvious, but they didn't. So that's a mistake in my view.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I think what you're really saying is that the act of charging him with any offence, whether it was in DC or Florida or Georgia or New York, was to raise him like a phoenix from the ashes into the public mind.
It did.
And, I mean, people talked about this last night from the Trump campaign, saying that Mar-a-Lago, the bloke running security at the gate, had the easiest job in the world. No one wanted to come. No one was visiting Trump. He was anathema after January 6th, and maybe they should have just let it run. I mean, I'm in two minds about it. Probably believe that, his shenanigans in the wake of the 2020 election result probably shouldn't have been tolerated. But you may have a point there. But having said that, you've got to actually prove that he incited them, and a little bit of rhetoric at a speech at the, what was it? It was something, I can't remember the movement, but the Fight the Vote or whatever it was, that would probably not be enough to convict on incitement. There would be other matters like his slowness to respond.
If that's the case, the worst thing you can do is try and gin up a whole lot of charges and patch them together and make a quilt out of them, because that just looks like, as indeed a significant proportion of the American population did, that just looks like you are using the law as a weapon against him. And that's what it looked like to a lot of people, and that did the Democrats a great deal of harm and made him the nominee.
Okay. I just do want to come in. This is, I mean, probably Churchill, de Gaulle. We're talking about political comebacks from nowhere. those two
Nixon?
in the 20th century.
Nixon?
Not nowhere near like this. And
Because some of our listeners might know, but Nixon lost to John
1960.
Kennedy. He made the famous speech where he said to the media, "You're not going to have me to kick around anymore."
That's right.
And that was meant to be the end of his political career. And a few years later, he was in the Oval Office after all.
68. Yeah, he was back in 68, and the Democrats fell apart around that time too, driven in part by LBJ, who declined, wasn't going to nominate as a presidential candidate, and then Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, of course, which left it in the hands of Hubert Humphrey.
One of my just before we leave the indictments, one of my friends is always telling me that, well, really, this was all done by the Department of Justice. It was nothing to do with the administration, and that's just not right. There is no fourth arm of government called the Department of Justice. It is part of the executive.
Well, it doesn't explain Georgia, though, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Those prosecutions are all dead. I mean, let's get that out there first. So the New York 34 conviction count there, that will lead to a fine, possibly a period of probation, something of that order. The DOJ or Smith's pursuit of Trump in the DC was known as the 4-count indictment. That dies. The Florida matter was on life support anyway. That dies. And the Georgia RICO matter, well, I can't see that proceeding at all. So this is an astonishing comeback for a lot of reasons.
The New York case about the inflated values of the properties. I watched the video of the argument in the Court of Appeal, and that's dead.
What do you mean it's dead?
I watched the questions that the justices asked in the Court of Appeal, and it looked awfully like that was falling apart.
But he's been convicted on those matters. You think the conviction will be overturned on appeals?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll see about that. I just wanted to establish, in terms of history being made pretty much as we speak or as we've followed over the last week, Trump is now the most significant political figure of the 21st century and the most powerful figure around the globe. I mean, you could say that about any president, but because he has almost certainly support in both houses of the Congress, and because of the manner of his comeback, his power is almost absolute, Jack. And he's got a number of things.
It's his party. It's his party right now.
Yeah, he owns it. He owns it now. One wondered what he was going to do had he lost, or how the GOP would have responded had he lost. But that's just not it. So let's have a look at some of the Trump policies, Jack. One is to reinstate the tax cuts, the 2017 tax cuts, which obviously were giving more to those with wealth than those without it. But there were middle-class tax cuts as well in that bargain. We're talking about tariffs. And tariffs, of course, he doesn't need a legislative support there from Congress. He can do that by a presidential edict to increase tariffs. He mentioned, increasing tariffs to Mexico just on the eve of the election, increasing tariffs on China, which he's mentioned throughout the campaign, immigration and borders. So,
can I just say something about tariffs? Tariffs, I think, long-term are a terrible idea. They punish all the wrong people. But as a short-term measure to force other countries to deal with you the way that you want to, they are a great way of exercising the huge muscle that is the United States economy.
Yeah, but if you tinker with tariffs, what happens is the consumer, the end user, ends up paying more.
That's true. That's the long-term problem.
What Trump is talking about is a tariff so high that would immediately prevent the export or the import of those goods into the United States.
Yep.
That the country supplying them simply won't supply them. This might come in the form of China's manufactured electric vehicles, for example, Jack. And that if the tariffs are that high, then there'll be no point introducing them into the marketplace, into the US market. We'll get to Australian ramifications soon, but yeah, there seemed to be broad support for tariffs, I don't think people seem to understand what a tariff is and how it affects really. If a tariff is increased by, let's say, 15% on, let's say, a white good imported from China, that means that it's going to cost more to buy a washing machine or a refrigerator than it did before. And because the importer and the retailer are all going to pass that cost on to the consumer. So I think America's about to find out what tariffs are really all about. But I think most of what the rhetoric around tariffs is for Trump is to impose tariffs so high across certain industries, and I've mentioned the one about EVs, so I think we're in for a rocky old road there.
But he uses them as a threat. The comment about Mexico was that you do what I want to do on the border, or I will put tariffs on. So he's expecting that they will cave and do what he wants to do on the border, and there won't be tariffs.
All right, so there's a lot to get through there, Jack. I think there's a fair amount of concern, fair amount of anxiety about some of the potential Trump cabinet appointments. I think the first one would be Bobby Jr. on Health and Human Services, Jack. How do we look at that? My God.
It's a bit bizarre, really, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think the best thing we can hope for there, Jack, is that Trump has one of his famous falling outs with people, and Bobby Kennedy gets given his marching orders fairly early on. He did. I would
have thought that's fairly likely. That's the most likely result because they're both difficult people.
Fingers crossed. Because Trump was saying in a sort of almost a dog whistling way to perhaps some libertarian voters and others out there in the anti-vax movement that he was going to have a look at childhood vaccination. We didn't mention it as in specifics, but he was going to let Bobby Kennedy look after vaccination program, which must send a shiver down a few people's spines. The other thing is, of course, Jack, women's reproductive rights. And now Bobby was interviewed, and this footage was run through the campaign and earlier. And Bobby Jr. saying that he would prefer a federal ban based at 15 weeks after conception. And I think that may well be a stumbling block with Trump too, who's always maintained that it is a matter for the states.
And you'd never get a congressional approval for a 15-week ban.
It's one of those things. Kennedy just lives in this kind of fantasy world. I don't think he'll last terribly long, but that might just be optimism on my part. Women's reproductive rights generally, Jack. Let's assume that remains the case. There are some terribly restrictive prohibitions and restraints on women in certain states throughout the United States. Florida just had a referendum which they lost, which sought to overturn the GOP ban there from was it 6 weeks after conception?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but that was overturned. I mean, you could say the will of the people, but I'm not so sure that women's reproductive rights should come down to a 50+1 exercise. It's likely that Trump will allow the states to continue, and in the South and in Texas and places where there are some really draconian laws in place, it looks like those laws will be in place for some time, which is a real problem.
I just don't think it's possible to get the agreement of enough Congress people in the House or the Senate to pass a uniform law.
Well, I understand the political ramifications. What I'm saying is in an ideal world, this shouldn't be a political football. In an ideal world, it should be a simple matter. The policy should just say what conversations and arrangements are made between a woman and her doctor should be sacrosanct and leave it at that.
Except that there's 50 years of political history of politics being involved in that in the United States, and you can't just wave that away with a magic wand.
Yeah, look, I understand all of that, but what we have is, and we're doing it now, to be honest, a little bit of an irony here. A couple of old blacks talking about what women of reproductive age should be doing with their bodies, and I wish it wasn't political here. We've had it pop up here.
I don't want to be involved in it. I can guarantee you of that. But the reality is that the American public as a whole want politics to be involved in that. And until they're persuaded not to, I'm afraid politics is in it.
There's just been some really terrible rhetoric, and we're not just talking about the last year or so, but over that sort of 50-year period when really it should have been explained away as a medical decision that one undertakes between their doctor and themselves. And that's where the rhetoric should have been aimed rather than, oh, what do we do, 15, 20, 36, it's just all a bit mad.
The Supreme Court thought they were doing that with Roe v. Wade, taking the politics out of it, but they were wholly unsuccessful in taking the politics out of it.
Well, they were successful for a while, Jack. They were
successful in having the law as they wanted it to be, but they never succeeded ever in taking the politics out of it.
Yeah, well, we don't have women dying, right? Women dying or women being forced to go full term, all these sorts of things. So, it is a really strange thing. God only knows how Kennedy's going to deal with it, but I suspect that Trump will just refer it all to the states where there are some terrible laws. Moving on.
So the problem in Congress and the House and the Senate is that you're not going to be able to get enough support for a uniform position because the people from the states with very unrestricted laws won't want to restrict their states, and the people with very restricted laws won't want to unrestrict their laws. So the chances of getting a majority are almost zero.
Terrible time for women of reproductive age, Jack. Let's just leave it at that. I think. What happens? Well, Stephen Miller become Homeland Secretary. Secretary of Homeland Security, or is it Director? I can't remember. And there's some pretty ugly stuff there too, Jack. What are they going to do? A bit of history for our listeners. There are an estimated 15 million illegal immigrants in the United States right now. This has been a figure that's been bandied about going all the way back to George W. Bush's time. And the response was always, the policy response, which they could never get sort of bipartisanship on, was essentially a logistical problem that they needed to deal with. You can't extract 15 million people from the economy, from society, and just kick them out. So needs must sort of led to a decision that was followed on by the Obama administration, but never had support in the Congress, that these 15 million people would be brought into the system, encouraged to become citizens, etc., etc., etc. So that was the response. Trump has been saying that these people are going to be removed, and I don't know how they go about it, and it raises some pretty dismal images, Jack. People being taken away in trucks and what have you.
I don't think you can remove them all. I think you can remove some, and I think you can stop new arrivals. No one trusts Congress to fix this because they've been faffing about with it for 30 years, and no one believes that they are serious about trying to fix it. Every deal they come up with in Congress is full of loopholes and cutouts to fit this group or that group. They're not serious about it. If you stop new arrivals, people will accept dealing with the existing population.
Possibly. Yeah, okay.
You must re-establish that we have a border. That's what you've got to do.
Yeah. I remember in the wake of the 2020 election result looking at reasons why Trump lost, and people would say rather glibly that it was the pandemic, and certainly that was a significant issue. But a number of supporters of his, or people who had voted for him in 2016, particularly in the Midwest, in places like Minnesota, in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, were alarmed at, you might remember, the extraction of illegal immigrants, or the extraction of the children, and then they couldn't put the children back with their parents. There were some 800 odd children who have been and basically have been taken away from their parents and never been reunited with them. And that caused a great deal of angst, because America is an immigration nation like Australia, but I think Americans have a stronger view of their heritage. Let's say their grandfathers or their great-grandfathers or their grandmothers' stories of immigration to America, that I think, Stephen Miller I wouldn't think would be known for his light touches. But I think if you do have that sort of vision of people being bundled into trucks or van, I think that would be a pretty grim image for a lot of Americans to deal with.
Yeah, it would be a losing image. I don't expect that to happen. Have you ever been to the Ellis Island Museum?
No, but you mentioned it before.
It's well worth a look. And one third of the 300 million people in America can trace their ancestors coming through one little island in New York Harbour.
Yeah, and look, Australians should be able to too, but we don't. We sort of, oh, we're here now, and how did you get here? Oh, I really don't know. I guess it was my great grandfather or something. I don't know. People who are second generation Australians obviously do know, but Americans do have a sort of profound interest in their heritage, how they got to America, where they were from before that.
Yeah, America, like Australia, is a very successful immigration country. At the moment, it's a running sore in America because the border's open. Once you get the border closed and you have migration, but it's controlled, fixing the problem with the 15 million people who are already here, that's easy enough to do.
All right. Thanks for that, Jack.
That's how I see it. But America's problems with immigration are easier to fix than the European ones.
Yeah, they certainly are. I'd agree with that. Attorney General, Jack, any ideas?
He had an excellent one in Bill Barr, but I don't think Bill's going to come out and work for him again.
I think that's one of those broken relationships that Trump has, Jack.
Yeah.
What about Ken Paxton, the Texas Attorney General?
Yeah, he could be. Bill Barr did come out and recommend and say he would be voting for Trump, but he does have. I don't think he wants to renew the relationship. But yeah, Paxton would be quite okay.
Well, Paxton, in your words, I am paraphrasing your words. If he's not a crook, he does a pretty good impersonation of one. He's had some problems. Mike Lee is another one who might be, as a Utah senator, might be one who gets roped in. That also a lawyer. Defence, Jack, any ideas? Marco Rubio's been mentioned there.
Look, they'll toss a few of those jobs around. I mean,
it'll be a big job, Jack, because there's a fairly serious disconnect between Trump and the military now.
Yeah, and that's not a problem.
Well, it needs to be managed. So, so another one that's been mentioned is Tom Cotton, senator from Arkansas,
who's pretty impressive, actually.
Well, he's pretty hawkish. So
but he can write and he can speak. He's got some goods about him.
So he might be the one that links up the military too, because they love a hawk, don't they? The US Green Machine. Rubio as Secretary of Defence, distinct possibility. Secretary of State, I see people are talking about Richard Grenell, Jack.
It's a possibility, I suppose.
Yeah.
You never know how these people are going to go on their job until you give it to them.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, Richard Grenell is the first openly gay holder of a cabinet position during the first Trump administration, and served as acting director of national intelligence, ambassador to Germany, and special envoy to Serbia and Kosovo.
Is he the Aussie? I can't remember.
I don't think he was born in Australia, but I don't think so. I'd have to have a bit of a look there, a bit of a look-see, but we'll move on. So, yes, the Trump cabinet to be announced. One thing I will ask you, Jack, obviously Biden and Trump don't get on, and at the same time they've got to go through all those pleasantries. Well, but I suppose they don't have to. Trump didn't in 2020 in terms of a peaceful handover.
Yeah. But I
that's
think that will go.
Going to have some awkward scenes. Scenes there.
I would be surprised if they did any more than a minimum.
It would be. I don't think there'll be any letters in the drawer of what is it? The redoubt, the desk.
The resolute desk.
Resolute. Yes. All right. Well, we just want to move now.
But the whole cabinet thing. They tend to take advantage of the gap between now and January 19 or whatever the inauguration is. So there's a fair bit of time for jockeying and vetting and looking at who's going to suit things. So, the couple of days after an election's a bit early to be thinking about just who it's going to be.
Richard Grenell, born in Michigan, Jack. Jefferson, Michigan. Yeah. I'm not sure who the Australian is, but okay, so let's look at the impact around the world. So we've got President Trump now with this, not just authority across the United States political system, but across the world now. I mean, that authority may not have been there in 2016 and on in that first term, but it certainly is now. So what happens in the Middle East, Jack? Trump has basically, during the campaign, has said that basically Netanyahu should conclude his operations in Gaza.
Should get it done, but
go on.
Should get it done, but get it done quickly.
And so there will be some pressure on Netanyahu there. And as I say, while someone like Benjamin might have dealt with Joe Biden with kid gloves, he's going to have to listen when Trump speaks. What happens in the Ukraine, Jack?
Just before we leave the Middle East, the Houthis made an announcement this morning that they declared that our operation in the international waters were for defensive purposes only, and we announced an immediate ceasefire. I suspect that Iran and its puppets around the region, the Houthis, its proxies around the region, will be very much more cautious because Israel's done them an enormous amount of damage, and to Iran itself. Iran's effectively without any air defences now, and they would suspect that Trump would be on the side of Israel and the other Arab countries, and they will be right on the back foot, and that's a good thing.
Yes, didn't put Iran in my list of things, and I think that's right. The mullahs would have slept poorly last night, Jack.
Yeah, that crazy bastard. Who knows what he might do to us? You know,
exactly right. So, but more importantly, what happens in the Ukraine? Now, Trump has said he'll knock this one over in a week. Do everyone a deal that they can't refuse, all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit more complex than that, isn't it?
It takes me back to Easter when the joke was, Christ came back to life in 2 days. I'd have done it in 2, in 3 days. I'd have done it in 2. One, mate.
Look, he was a good guy, but he's not as good as me. What happens in the Ukraine? I mean, by the sounds of things, what will happen is that the land that basically has been taken by the Russians will, there'll be a lot of pressure on Zelensky to concede that. That Ukraine is going to get a lot smaller. In fact, the Russians might say, well, we want 40% of it, and they'll settle with 30 sort of thing, if we're going to do the deal. Certainly, Vladimir Zelensky would have had a very difficult night's sleep too last night.
Yes. Don't forget, there's still a bit of the property developer from Queens about Donald Trump. He likes to do a deal.
Likes to do a deal, but what does
likes
it
to
tell?
Negotiate hard.
What does it? I mean, if Ukraine has to concede, let's say, 20% of its territory, of its sovereign land, what does it tell? What does it tell Putin about next time? Oh, I'll go to Moldova, I'll go to Poland. What does it tell them? That basically, if you invade, if you bomb cities, if you slaughter civilians, massacre civilians, and take territory, there will be no penalty for that.
I suspect what Trump thinks is the deal is that in return for what Putin gets, Ukraine gets a fair bit as well, and that's it. Now, I don't know whether he can pull that off. Got no idea. But I suspect that's what we're looking for. Yeah.
Now, look,
5 days if there's no interruptions,
For what it's worth, Vladimir Putin has said that he is looking forward to hearing what Donald Trump has to say about that. We do know that there are North Korean soldiers running around in Ukraine at the moment, Jack. I saw some footage of a couple who came to grief. Yeah, so more broadly, Jack, what happens to NATO and Europe?
Just before we leave the North Koreans, there's been a couple of things. They're enjoying the good food more than they're accustomed to.
And the pornography.
And they're enjoying their first untrammeled look at the internet. And they're very much enjoying that. So
yes, I believe some of them have racked up fairly significant addictions to pornography. Not permitted in North Korea. But it tells you that, Russian numbers, obviously Russian soldier numbers are getting a bit tight. Yes, well, we'll have to wait and see about that. I mean, how is NATO? Will NATO survive 4 more years of Trump?
Yeah, of course it will. He wanted to push NATO into taking up some of the slack, into actually fulfilling their part of the bargain. And all these bluster last time had some effect. They are actually increasing their spending. Not all of them. I looked at this morning. Not all of them, but
most of them have essentially around Ukraine. Germany are weighing in with a lot more than they were, those sorts of things. All right, what about Australian interests, Jack? I wonder, we've been reading a lot of op-eds about how Trump is going to be good for Australia's national interest. I can't see AUKUS surviving it, certainly surviving a president who is by instinct an isolationist.
It would probably require a rethink, I think. Yeah.
I don't think that's a bad thing, though, Jack. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. And this is something that Keating's been talking about. Others, including Bob Carr. Oh, good Lord. By the way, Jack, as if it wasn't hard enough for those on the left to deal with what happened yesterday, Scott Morrison was back on our television set saying, "Oh, it's going to be great under Trump." Jesus Christ! Can I get kicked anymore?
Well, here's a guess, right? Why was Scott Morrison back on the television? Because look, he didn't have a bad relationship with Trump, and poor old Scott's a bit shy of the money. And he would be thinking, well, I can turn this into a consultancy gig somewhere, you know.
Yeah, he might get a gig with Joe Hockey, who's got the consultancy gig in New York City and has employed a number of Trump people. So Joe will have a big smile on his face today.
Yeah, a very good night for Joe Hockey last night.
Yeah, so quite seriously, I think what Paul Keating has been saying about AUKUS needs to be re-examined. And Jack, we might put a bit of time aside for our next show to look at AUKUS, what it's all about, whether it will survive, and what alternatives there are.
Certainly, I've got no objection to people having another look at it. Right
now, I can tell you that Australia's missile system can only hit one nation, and that is Timor-Leste. So we need, rather than put ourselves under the American umbrella, which can change by circumstance, electoral circumstance like those of yesterday, for example, and all of a sudden our strategic interests have changed. And so I think Keating's points, perhaps not always subtly put, Jack, probably need to be re-examined. So let's just make a bit of a note for our listeners that we will have a look at the AUKUS arrangements, what they involve, what alternatives there might be, and just we might just also want to speculate on how it survived with Trump, Morrison, a whole heap of the commentariat seem to believe that it'll just go smoothly through. But I think if Trump has a look at this and go, what are we doing now? We're giving them submarines or the UK submarines built on American models. What are we doing? I think that might get thrown in the bin fairly quickly. Also, Jack, there is a prospect of a tariff war with China, a US-China tariff war. And, of course, the United States is our most significant or important strategic partner, as China, of course, is our most significant or biggest trading partner. I can see Australia getting caught up in this, and it won't do anybody any good. I did see that Anthony Albanese spoke with the president this morning, our time, as we record this on the 7th of November, and free trade, according to Albanese, was part of that message.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult to comment on things that we don't know about. We don't know the seriousness of, but Trump has mentioned sort of 200% type tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example. I mean, where will it leave us? I mean, I suspect quite isolated, with the Chinese well within their rights to say, what are you doing? What are you doing? I thought we were supposed to be cleaner. Of course, China uses tariffs as punishment, as Australian exporters well know too.
It's all I would say about it at this stage is, because we don't know what kind of landscape we're looking at, is that it's going to have to be handled from Australia's perspective with a good deal of skill.
Yeah. And finally, Jack, as we conclude our review of the presidential election, US presidential election, can Kevin Rudd survive as our ambassador to the US? Your answer first.
Do you think this is why he was deleting all the old tweets?
He was on the delete. For the life of me, some of these were on his website, so we're not talking about X or Twitter or things like that. But for the life of me, I don't know why prominent people, including journalists, don't set their accounts up on Twitter, for example, or X, to delete messages after every year. It continually astonishes me to see that people have got tweets available from 10 years ago.
The other thing that's astonishing about it is that, David Lammy, the foreign minister of the United Kingdom, is in big trouble about this because some of these people, they're like student politicians. They want the applause, so they want to jump on social media or jump on their website or make a speech where they are excoriating some public figure from another country. And sensible adult people in this situation don't do that because they understand that if they're going to continue to have a public role,
time and circumstances change.
Yeah, and that they may have to sit across the table from this person.
I look. I'm not, a profound critic of Rudd's. We've got a little bit of history, but it's not significant. I don't think he can stay in that job. And I think his talents might be better served in Beijing, particularly if there is some
they don't like him much
over trade.
They don't like him much up there. They don't like him much up there either.
No one likes Kevin. Look, come on. The only people who don't like Kevin are the people who haven't met him. But I just think the current environment in the United States, the fact that he's, as you say, was busily deleting them all today, but it's been a bit of a running sore for a little while in our politics that Kevin Rudd may not. And look, to his credit, he has been assiduously establishing contact with Trump administration people. He's doing his work. He's doing the sorts of things that he should be doing. But I just think, we do know that Donald doesn't take criticism all that well, and the fact that Kevin had handed out some might work against Australia's interests.
Yeah. Personally, I think if you were in the cabinet office in Australia, that would be on your agenda. We should have a look at this.
We need to have quite seriously, we need to have a conversation about this.
Yeah.
Who are the sorts of people who would be very good in that job, Jack? I mean, besides Kevin Rudd, look, he is an occasionally very irritating human being, but he also is, has a profound knowledge of global politics, of geopolitics. Yeah. Who would be a good person for Labor to appoint as a replacement?
We've had a long list of pretty good ambassadors to the US, some excellent ones. Kim Beazley, Andrew Peacock, Dennis Richardson. Who else has been over there? They've all been pretty good. All come from slightly different backgrounds, but you've just got to find someone with enough weight and understanding to do the job.
Yeah, I don't think Kevin Rudd in that position is sustainable. It certainly needs to be considered by the cabinet, by the Australian cabinet, and a replacement sort. Of course, when we speak of Kennedy's with Bobby Jr., his cousin is the US ambassador to Australia, and that will almost come to an end too, Jack.
Yeah, no, those positions are
political.
Are at the whim of the occupant of the Oval Office. So that will end.
I can't remember who Trump's ambassador was in Australia. Do you remember? I can't remember.
The position was vacant. It was a deputy ambassador for a while.
That's right.
And I can't think who the person was who got the job in the end. But
he would have been a donor. He wouldn't have been on the $5 list either. He would have been a fairly significant donor, I would imagine. That's just the way the game works.
Generally, you've got to chip in a few bucks to get to swan around and be called Mr. Ambassador or Madam Ambassador.
All right. Well, that's going to sort of take us out from the program. What we'd say to our listeners, whether you are a Trump fan or not, and we suspect many of our listeners are not, all I'd say is don't fret, don't worry too much. We could all die and be incinerated in a nuclear conflagration, but let's try and have some fun in the meantime. One of the things that I found amusing about Donald Trump's first 4 years were hugely funny. I mean, there were some great moments there. Who can remember? Who could ever forget Trump with the Easter Bunny, with a cartoon Easter Bunny, staring into the sun during a solar eclipse? There were just so many great moments. Or walking with the Queen when they just told him, don't get ahead of the Queen. Whatever you do, don't get ahead of the Queen, don't get ahead of the Queen. And found himself ahead of the Queen and then just forgot how to walk for a while. It was very, very funny. It'll keep us amused. These are not too dark. The days shouldn't be too dark, and we should have a few laughs along the way. And we'll try and keep you informed. In the meantime, Jack, what would you say about the Trump presidency? I mean, in terms of some fairly gloomy thoughts around it from our listeners.
I can't understand. I still can't understand that because it's not an unknown. He has been president for 4 years. I've watched all these journos carrying on like arguing about who's going to be first into the cattle trucks to be taken away.
To be fair, Jack, it wasn't journalists saying that. It was a two-star general who called him a fascist.
Yeah.
John Kelly.
All of that's a bit odd. Just before we go, a mate sent me this morning of a clip that I'd quite forgotten about of Saturday Night Live. This was post Hillary Clinton losing the election, and they had one of their stars. I forget which one it was now. Dressed up as Hillary Clinton, sitting at the piano and singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And at the end of that, saying, "I'm not giving up and neither should you," in that very serious Hillary voice. And I thought, gee, that's a pretty terrible way to end a political campaign. But then I remembered when Obama finished his term of office, Saturday Night Live topped that because they had two of their stars singing "To Sir with Love" to Obama.
That's cringy.
So who knows what Harris is going to get this week from Saturday Night Live?
There is also the Pete Davidson, who tells a story about how Trump was on SNL.
He's been on a few times.
Well, they did a table read. Pete Davidson tells a story about. He says, there's only really one or two stories I can tell. I'm allowed to tell about that. And he said they were all doing a table read, and Trump walks into the room, and Ivana was in the sketch as well. And Trump looked around at the EP and said, "Listen, I'm just going to use my own words because in Davidson's words, he said Trump can't read. Trump can't read." Or he can't read little things like semicolons or hyphens or anything like that. I don't understand what they mean. So he ended up referring to the script said, "I'm going, well, let's go off and get, and let's go in and get something, turkey legs," which means we're going to go have a turkey leg from a stand. But he actually, because he doesn't understand commas, he ended up referring to his daughter as turkey legs. Yes, that's just one thing. We have a functional literate in the White House, folks. I wouldn't worry about it. Look, they've had some absolute garbage presidents in the past, and how he'll measure up, well, we'll see. We'll get the academics to provide their list of the worst presidents, as they do almost every year.
But he can deliver a line. He's not a bad comedian. There's a very good Saturday Night Live skit. It's called "The Prince and the Pauper," where he changes places with, I can't remember the name of the actor, who becomes President Trump. And before he was president, this is, and Trump becomes the janitor. And there's a very good skit about
they got him into the suit.
He walks in and they have a little bit of fun with who's got the worst hair. It's quite a good skit.
Okay, well, he's not one of the great humorists of our time for mine. But look, as I say, listeners, it's going to be, well, strap yourselves in. It's going to be a wild ride, but there will be moments of humour, and we'll try and keep you up to date with all of them. We'll be returning next week with our normal show. We hope you've enjoyed our presidential coverage. I always thought Trump was going to win until about 2 weeks ago, and I thought, okay, this might be a little bit unusual. I was, shall we say, pessimistic about what would happen. And then in the last couple of weeks, I thought, maybe he just hasn't got across the line. It might work against him. Turned out to be absolute rubbish, and he won by the length of the straight. Mm-hmm. So we'll be back with our shows next week. Myself in Hong Kong, Jack. And you can drop us a line whenever you feel like it. You can get hold of me on X, on @JackTheInsider. And you can get hold of Jack on his Substack, which is
hongkongjack.substack.com.
And that sees us out for today. We'll talk to you next week. See ya.